Shivering under a crimson sunset, Lydia Halley braced herself behind a battered wagon wheel, clutching her worn journal like a shield. Suddenly, the distant thunder of hooves announced a troop of cavalry approaching their uniforms, cutting a stark silhouette against the plains. She held her breath. Would they tear her from the safe haven she'd found with the Pawnee medicine man Red Hawk? Or would they believe her ghost woman reputation and leave without investigating? In that tense moment, the fragile peace she had painstakingly built hung by a thread. Would she be forced back into the world she'd fled? Dear friends, the next part of this powerful story reveals whether Lydia's hard-won healing stands firm against these new threats. Make sure to listen to the entire tale to see if Lydia can safeguard the bridge between her old identity and the Pawnee wisdom that saved her soul. And if you appreciate such gripping frontier accounts, subscribe to our channel for more true-to-life adventures that inspire and challenge. A soft ribbon of dawn light tinted the eastern edge of the Great Plains, illuminating the endless stretch of grassland in delicate pinks and golds. 4 years earlier, that very horizon had promised new beginnings for Lydia Halley. She was then a 26-year-old schoolteacher, newly married and brimming with optimism about frontier life. Riverton Creek, a modest settlement where she taught, a handful of homesteaders' children had accepted her with cautious hope. Her Eastern education met their rough and tumble environment, forging something neither purely genteel nor purely wild. In a single morning, though a violent rage swept away every certainty she had, her husband Alan, her friends, the settlement's humble wagon train, and the sense of civilized order that once structured her world. Lydia alone crawled from beneath that burning wreck, physically unscarred, but psychologically fragmented, in ways that defied neat description. For 4 years, she roamed the prairies as a near specter, drifting from place to place in battered, threadbare garments, stealing away from human contact like an elusive wraith. At first, no one understood how she had survived the massacre that took nearly 20 lives in mere minutes. By all appearances, no one could have outlived that ambush. The settlers had been grossly outnumbered, with no chance to mount a defense before firearms arrows and fire concluded the assault in brutal efficiency. The wagon train's meager security detail proved useless, crumpling under the raiders' sudden onslaught. By midday, every adult and child lay still except Lydia, who by sheer misfortune or unholy luck had hidden beneath the shattered planks of a toppled wagon. Overwhelmed by shock, she spent days burying her neighbors and friends, her hands blistering then bleeding from the work of digging shallow graves on unforgiving ground. She ate nothing, spoke to no one, and clung only to the charred Bible of her late husband and a small notebook in which she had once recorded lesson plans and children's test scores. When she finally wandered away from that horrific scene, she was more phantom than person, her spirit bludgeoned by grief. Nights blurred into weeks. She avoided any settlements or passing riders, fearful that contact would reopen wounds. She was desperate to keep sealed. Stories spread among ranchers and hunters about a solitary woman glimpsed on the horizon at dusk. A ghost widow, some said, half believed to be an omen of ill luck. Such superstitions spread with the speed of rumor in the sparsely populated plains. Once an old ranch hand tried to offer her water and a coat. Lydia fled, stumbling across the grass as though the man's kindness was a blazing fire. Another time, she inadvertently wandered near a remote trading post only to slip away before curious eyes could confirm whether she was actually alive or some manifestation of frontier myth. Over the following years, she learned survival from the land by painful trial and error, tracking small game in the high grass, unearthing wild tubers, building crude windbreaks from fallen timber. Yet she found no solace in her newly acquired feral instincts. Nights she trembled in the open, racked by nightmares of the massacre. Days she moved with a mechanical purpose, each step her answer to an unvoiced question: why continue at all? Her battered notebook, once devoted to grammar exercises and sums now held only scribbles, half delirious confessions, repeated images of burning wagons, or simple lines that read, "I am still here," as though Lydia had to remind herself of that fact repeatedly. That half-life might have continued indefinitely if not for a bitter snowstorm in her fourth winter on the plains. When that storm blasted across the prairie, bearing landmarks in white and dropping temperatures to lethal lows, Lydia pressed on in confusion, convinced she deserved no better than to perish under the howling sky. In that delirium, she would have died but for the unexpected arrival of Red Hawk, a Pawnee medicine man whose dwelling lay hidden beyond a small ridge. Drawn by footprints in the snow, he found her collapsing half-frozen near a lifeless patch of sod. He lifted her unresisting body and carried her into his earthen lodge, where the storm's roar yielded to the soft crackle of a fire. Unbeknownst to Lydia, that single decision, his act of shelter, would spark an extraordinary recalibration of her entire being. In the first disoriented moments upon waking in Red Hawk's earthen lodge, Lydia Halley barely recognized her own limbs. They felt weighted as though stones were strapped to her bones. The circular walls spun in her vision, lit by the flicker of firelight that danced across animal hides, bundles of dried plants, and carefully placed carved figures. She coughed, drawing in air that smelled of smoke and herbs. Her immediate reaction was panic. Where was she? Who had brought her here? But she discovered she was too weak to do more than stare at the man sitting across the embers. He was unlike anyone she had encountered. In the settlement, Lydia had known a few natives who came to trade or simply pass by, often with quiet reserve, but Red Hawk, with his broad shoulders, long braids, and calm, unwavering gaze, exuded a presence that seemed simultaneously gentle and unyielding. His English, when he finally spoke, was accented but clear. You woke to see another sunrise. The storm wanted your life, but your body disagreed. Lydia found no immediate words in reply. She had spoken so little over the past years that her voice felt more foreign than his accent. He placed a small clay bowl of steaming liquid at the edge of the fire. It warms the blood, he explained. Drink. Spurred by thirst, she inched forward with cautious, trembling movements, seizing the bowl as though it might vanish. The tea, some mix of mint and bitter roots, stung her mouth, but its heat spread through her in a wave of unexpected relief. She stared at her rescuer, uncertain whether to fear him, be grateful, or both. Red Hawk made no demands. He neither pried into her past nor forced conversation. Over the next hour, she dozed in fitful intervals, each time rousing to find him tending the fire, stirring another pot of herb mixture, or sorting dried plants with quiet purpose. Not once did he crowd her or exhibit impatience. Slowly, Lydia's mind cleared enough to realize she was inside a Pawnee Earth lodge, something she'd read about but never expected to see firsthand. The structure's domed earthen walls provided insulation against the savage cold, and it was arranged in a way that seemed to merge practicality with reverence for nature. A ring of wooden pillars, a central fire pit below a smoke hole, and carefully designated spaces for sleep, storage, and ritual. During that initial period, Lydia remained silent except for a few disjointed phrases. Her own name she offered in a rasp so quiet, Red Hawk had to lean forward to catch it. Lydia, he repeated, tasting the syllables as though they might hold clues to her condition. Then in a measured tone he added, I am Red Hawk. My people call me a caretaker of body and spirit. Some might say medicine man. I walk the path that aids healing. It was not lost on Lydia that this man, supposedly from a group her old settlement would have labeled hostile Indians, was the first person in years to show her genuine unconditional care. She recalled how she used to be Miss Halley, the schoolteacher who lectured children about grammar and multiplication. That woman had vanished beneath a wagon, emerging as little more than a haunted wanderer. Yet here, sheltered by an earthen dome, as winter raged outside, she felt a kernel of long-forgotten familiarity, the feeling of being cared for, the reminder that not all humans were threats. Her battered journal, which she had clutched in the storm, lay beside her, nearly tossed into the fire, if not for Red Hawk's careful salvage. She pressed it to her chest as though it were a protective charm. The dryness in her throat prevented her from explaining its importance. But Red Hawk understood. Your words on paper, he said, nodding toward the worn cover. They matter to you. She nodded, eyes downcast, uncertain how to convey the labyrinth of pain within her that had once found an outlet in its pages. The first day in Red Hawk's lodge blurred into the second. She drifted between pockets of sleep nightmares rearing up like storm clouds, whenever she closed her eyes only to dissipate under his calm presence. He never asked about the massacre or how she'd ended up alone. Each time she startled, awake gasping, he might add a log to the fire, quietly prepare a sedative brew, and retreat to his tasks. That routine, repeated in unwavering gentleness, cracked open a door in her consciousness, letting in the smallest ray of trust. She realized with something akin to amazement that she felt safer here among a people once demonized by her community than she had felt in years hiding from her own kind. By the third morning, Lydia possessed the strength and clarity to assess her surroundings with an almost scholarly detachment. The earthen walls held carefully placed artifacts, quillwork pouches, carved wooden figures, and bunches of dried herbs strung along supporting beams. A central circular pit served as both hearth and communal focus, with a vent above allowing smoke to escape. If her old settlement in Riverton Creek had labeled such abodes primitive, Lydia now recognized how thoroughly her fellow settlers had underestimated the ingenuity of Pawnee design. It offered insulation far superior to many wooden cabins, and the layout facilitated communal living without sacrificing privacy. In earlier times, she might have recorded notes about these observations in neat margin entries, comparing them to descriptions from anthropology books. Now freed from the constraints of formal academic posture, her interest felt more genuine. A curiosity untainted by condescension. She saw not an exhibit in a museum, but a lived environment brimming with knowledge that aligned with natural cycles. Red Hawk soon returned from an outside errand, collecting snow to melt for fresh water, or retrieving a hidden cache of roots, she wasn't certain. He moved with the assured grace of a man who interpreted the land's subtle signals with near innate skill. Lydia was reminded of the times she had fruitlessly tried to track game or read weather signs after her wagon train's destruction, stumbling in near blind trial. His presence reminded her that skill need not be boastful. He had said little about his people, only that they were wintering some distance away and would eventually pass through these plains when the buffalo herd shifted. Recognizing her newly awakened interest, Red Hawk spoke of the practicalities of Pawnee life. He showed Lydia how certain dried seeds were used to prepare nutritious gruels, how strips of jerky were hung well above the fire to maintain dryness, and how the lodge's low entrance helped contain heat in winter months. Each lesson seemed intended to empower her, not merely inform her. The Pawnee approach to knowledge, as he explained it, was less about strict lessons and more about guiding an individual to discover relationships between elements, fire, water, plants, wind. Gradually, Lydia tried to reciprocate. She pointed to her ragged notebook, indicating the brief bits of language or notes scribbled in shaky pencil lines. She murmured the word teacher, explaining in halting phrases that she had once used that notebook to plan lessons for children. Red Hawk listened, not with the vacant courtesy that older men in her original settlement had often shown female pursuits, but with genuine respect. He asked if she missed teaching, or if that role still mattered to her, surprised by how the question made her chest tighten. With conflicted emotions, she found herself admitting that once she had believed knowledge to be the highest gift one could impart. Now the memory of classroom order felt distant, overshadowed by the brutality she had witnessed. But Red Hawk saw more in her quiet longing than she herself recognized. To teach is also to heal. He remarked, his voice soft but carrying authority. If the spirit is wounded by terror, it finds strength when sharing knowledge with others. The path you walked might not be gone. It could simply lead someplace else. Over these days, something fragile yet vital sprouted between them, an understanding that neither tried to define as friendship romance or mere survival alliance. Lydia remained haunted by the ghosts of her past, but within the circular walls of Red Hawk's lodge, she began to see a path that moved beyond grim endurance. Each time she rose to stir the coals or fetch water from a small hole in the lodge's perimeter, she found her body responding less like an automaton and more like a person re-inhabiting her own limbs. Outside, the winter raged on winds howling across the plains. Inside, they established a rhythm that felt oddly timeless. Routine actions like preparing tea, sorting dried plants, or quietly reciting the Pawnee names for various roots. And every so often, Lydia would awaken at night trembling from nightmares of the blazing wagons, only to find Red Hawk at the fire adding a subtle mixture of herbs to quell her anxiety. Their mutual silence spoke volumes. She no longer felt the immediate urge to bolt or hide whenever she heard footsteps, even if those footsteps were his. In reciprocation, he never probed her with invasive questions. The spirit reveals wounds on its own time was his consistent refrain when she struggled to form words for her anguish. In scattered minutes, Lydia would take up her notebook again, turning pages where once a child's spelling tests had been pinned. Now those spaces contained half-formed reflections on survival, on winter's stoic lessons, on this man who offered a vantage on life she had never before considered. She wrote in spurts, uncertain whether the words were for herself for memory or for anyone who might one day find them. But each line she managed to write, each coherent sentence that bridged her past and present, felt like a seed planted in newly thawed soil. As winter's grip gradually weakened, Lydia came to see beyond the lodge's interior. Occasional forays into the surrounding snowfields taught her more about Red Hawk's daily routines, checking snare lines for rabbits and small game, gathering specific plants whose tough stalks still poked through drifts, observing wildlife movements to gauge broader ecological shifts. She began accompanying him on these short ventures, at first stumbling on half-frozen ground, then learning to move with a measured step that wasted minimal energy. Each time she caught a glimpse of her reflection in a partially frozen stream, it startled her. Gone was the disoriented specter with sunken cheeks and vacant eyes. She still looked weathered and worn, but her posture no longer sagged under invisible weight. During one expedition, Red Hawk paused to point at faint hoofprints crossing a shallow bank. "Deer passed here at dawn," he said. "They'll bed down near that ridge come midday. When the wind shifts, they move north." He didn't belabor how he knew these details. It was simply a statement of fact gleaned from patterns Lydia couldn't entirely see. She recalled how back in Riverton Creek she had taught children to analyze text for patterns, encouraging them to read between lines. Here in the open wilderness, Red Hawk read the earth as intimately as a teacher reads a beloved book. Sometimes after these outings, she would ask him about Pawnee beliefs, though she feared seeming intrusive. He never refused her curiosity. Instead, he gave measured answers that showed both pride in his heritage and caution about revealing certain sacred details. Through these conversations, Lydia understood that his role as a medicine man was not just to treat physical wounds, but also to maintain balance between tangible and intangible realm. Summoning or singing certain chants, he explained, was akin to bridging worlds, inviting unseen forces to participate in healing. His words resonated with her in ways that earlier Lydia might have dismissed as superstition. Now reminded daily of how intangible forces like grief and memory shaped her own fate. She was no longer so certain that her old definitions of rational and irrational held absolute truth. The intangible had nearly driven her to vanish from life. Perhaps intangible forces could also guide her back. As the days lengthened, she found herself experimenting with small tasks of daily life. One afternoon, she arranged the dried plants by type, labeling them with bits of cloth, on which she wrote Pawnee, or English names, bridging the language gap with small sketches or approximate phonetics. It became a mini-linguistic project, something that recalled the methodical teaching approach she had once championed. Red Hawk observed with quiet approval, occasionally correcting her pronunciation or clarifying a plant's usage. "You prefer order," he noted one evening, smiling without mockery. "It helps you see connections." Lydia laughed softly at that. Even in this earthen lodge with hardly a handful of possessions, she still clung to the idea of categorizing, naming, and listing. Yet she sensed that Red Hawk was equally systematic, only in a different manner. His categories were layered in stories and symbolic relations, rather than alphabetical or numeric sequences. A new tension seeped into her awareness as her daily companion taught her more. Once the hardest edge of winter gave way to spring, the outside world would reclaim them. She wondered if she could face that prospect. Before the massacre, she had believed thoroughly in rejoining civilization if anything amiss happened. But now, after all that had transpired, her old settlement's norms felt strangely claustrophobic. She also sensed that Red Hawk, for all his acceptance of her presence, might not be able to integrate her into Pawnee society unproblematically, but neither seemed to be pushing for a forced parting. They existed in a liminal space, an equilibrium that might dissolve once outside forces intruded. One morning, after checking a series of traps that yielded only a single hare, Red Hawk mentioned the traveling patterns of his band. By late spring, others come near this region. They gather where the buffalo pass. The unspoken question lingered. Would Lydia remain or vanish? Did she see a future among the Pawnee? Or did she yearn to reconnect with the Eastern ways that once shaped her entire worldview? She had no immediate answer. Instead, she added more wood to the fire and continued her new routine, documenting everything in her journal. The date, the temperature, guessed rather than measured. The plants they harvested, and the words Red Hawk used to describe them. Each line in her scrawling script reminded her of the bridging function that knowledge could have if approached with humility rather than conquest. Everything changed one day when Lydia spotted 3 mounted figures on the horizon. The small band of riders advanced in the early afternoon sun, visible from the vantage near a low rise she and Red Hawk occasionally used for gathering certain roots. At first, she thought they might be traveling traders or some distant ranchers searching for lost cattle. But as they came nearer, the glint of metal on uniforms identified them as cavalry. A civilian rider also accompanied them, the cut of his coat suggesting government or official business. Lydia's heart tightened. She had nearly forgotten how the world at large would interpret her presence here. Red Hawk told her calmly, They're heading toward a known route. If we don't wish to be seen, we can move behind that ravine. Yet part of Lydia resisted. She realized that continuing to hide would forever trap her in half-existence. Still, survival instincts reasserted themselves. These men could represent forced removal or meddlesome authority who might attempt to rescue her against her will. So she nodded and followed Red Hawk quietly behind a small ridge, letting the riders pass without noticing them. For now, that was enough to keep the outside world at bay. That close encounter, however, made it clear that winter's isolation was drawing to a close. The cavalry's reappearance signaled increased patrols and possibly new expansions of control or oversight. Soldiers watched the frontier for conflicts and enforced new lines on the land. Red Hawk explained, lines drawn on maps, but not on the earth itself. Lydia recalled how, in her school teacher role, she had lectured about neat geographical boundaries, state lines, property lines, and realized how superficial they seemed now. The once abstract concept of manifest destiny had in her mind softened to the horrifying memory of how expansion often entailed violence and erasure of existing peoples. That evening, lying awake on her pallet, Lydia replayed the moment she first saw those riders. It felt like a turning point, albeit an invisible one. She recognized that she couldn't simply continue in the sheltered lodge forever, nor could she drift about the plains without direction. A faint but growing sense of purpose unfurled within her. She had knowledge bridging two worlds, her old life's educational training and the healing insights gleaned from Pawnee practices. Could she find a way to integrate them to stand as a mediator rather than a fugitive from both sides? As the snow melted and spring asserted itself in tenacious patches of green, her spoken language skills also revitalized. Though she had never truly lost English, she had used it so infrequently that certain phrases felt clumsy on her tongue. Now she spoke to Red Hawk with greater fluency, sometimes explaining educational theories from her past or reciting fragments of old poems she remembered. He listened with an absorbing quiet, occasionally offering his own stories or songs in Pawnee, which she struggled to follow. But even partial comprehension stirred fascination in her. Both sets of knowledge she realized might complement rather than contradict each other if approached with humility. Amid these growing convictions, a new fear also brewed: official rescue parties that might appear armed with paternalistic zeal to reintegrate her forcibly. She envisioned a cavalry officer stepping into the lodge, ignoring her voice, labeling her traumatized and incompetent, and dragging her back to a settlement. She suspected that a settler society would interpret her living with a Pawnee medicine man as scandalous, if not outright immoral. The thought of it all made her tremble. She confessed these anxieties to Red Hawk one afternoon while they processed medicinal plants. He responded with the same measured calm. Your choices define your path. Not outside voices, but outside voices can carry power if you face them unprepared. That comment lodged in Lydia's mind. She realized that if she truly wanted to forge a path that respected both her heritage and the Pawnee way of life that had saved her, she needed a strategy for engaging the official world on her own terms. Hiding forever would only feed rumors of a mad white woman living in sin with savages. Public confrontation, on the other hand, might be lethal in a place where prejudice and rumor shaped every official decision. Thus, the idea to approach a military post on her own gradually crystallized. She would confirm her identity, rectify her legal status, after all, official records likely listed her as deceased, and secure whatever documents might forestall forced removal. This step, she recognized, demanded more courage than mere survival. It meant showing up as a self-determining individual, not a half-crazed specter. I need to stand in the open, Lydia told Red Hawk late one night, or they will always see me as a shadow. With quiet approval, he nodded, understanding that her path involved bridging a society that claimed her as a tragic memory and a people who might not be eager for more settlers' presence. Through the final days of early spring, Lydia composed letters to the East intended for her mother, her father, a younger sister in St. Louis, and a cousin who had once visited her frontier school. She had no illusions that their responses would be uniformly supportive, but the act of writing felt like reclaiming her rightful place in the broader story of her life. She also decided that to preserve some measure of dignity, she should approach the fort. She chose Fort Redwood, the nearest post with a stable command structure, where she could methodically present her case. That plan formed the spine of her next steps, though her hands trembled whenever she imagined standing before official authorities to explain how she had fallen in with the Pawnee. Red Hawk agreed to travel with her only to a certain point, reasoning that his direct presence inside Fort Redwood might complicate matters. The uniformed men see me as a puzzle to solve or a threat to contain, he explained. A Pawnee stepping inside their gates with a white woman would raise many questions, overshadowing your voice. Lydia appreciated his realism, even if part of her dreaded the actual moment she would walk the final mile alone. They set out on a crisp, sunlit morning with a pack of carefully chosen supplies, dried meats, water skins. Lydia's letters wrapped in oilcloth and a folded piece of hide on which she had attempted to map basic references gleaned from Red Hawk's earlier travels near the fort. This time the walk felt charged with a new sense of direction, unlike her aimless drifting after the massacre or the short forays from the lodge. They stopped at midday by a shallow creek. While Lydia drank, Red Hawk checked for tracks confirming that cavalry patrols had passed here recently. The discussion about how to approach them stirred the tension in her gut. Nevertheless, in the late afternoon, they came upon a vantage point overlooking Fort Redwood, a modest fortress of log walls and guard towers with a parade ground at its center. Smoke rose from cook fires. Soldiers in blue uniforms patrolled the perimeter. Memories of living behind such walls in Riverton Creek flickered in Lydia's mind. The fort spelled order, discipline, and the apparatus of official power. She inhaled deeply, reminding herself that she no longer needed to cower. She had chosen to re-enter this environment on her own terms, bearing no illusions. That acceptance would be automatic. Red Hawk gestured to a small copse of trees half a mile from the fort, indicating it as his temporary waiting point. "Come to me tomorrow, after your affairs inside are settled," he said, "or if they hold you longer, the next day. If you do not return by the third day, I will come looking." His calm tone belied the protective concern she sensed underneath. She fought the impulse to cling to him as a shield, recognizing that her autonomy in this step was crucial for the new identity she sought. With a final quiet "thank you," Lydia parted from him and approached the fort gate under the watchful gaze of two sentries. Their eyes flicked over her patched clothing and windblown hair, showing curiosity but no immediate hostility. "State your business." One commanded, a hand resting on his rifle, summoning the composure. Once honed in her classroom, Lydia replied, "I am Lydia Haley, presumed dead in the Riverton Creek Massacre. I have letters and information for the commanding officer." They ushered her inside, evidently startled by her direct claim. She was led to a small waiting area near the command post where a young soldier offered her water and attempted polite conversation, though his eyes kept drifting to the unusual mix of frontier garment and Pawnee-inspired stitching in her sleeves. The tension Lydia felt mingled with a strange relief that she was choosing to be here. No forced rescue or humiliating manhunt had dragged her from Red Hawk's lodge. She carried the sense of her own story, a narrative that placed her as an active protagonist, not a passive victim. Finally, a short officer with squared shoulders stepped in, introducing himself as Captain O'Neill, "Ma'am. He said we received word from another patrol that a woman matching your description might be out here. The entire post is curious, truth be told. Please follow me to speak with Colonel Farnsworth. He'll want your account personally." It's quite the event to have a massacre victim reappear after all this time. He made the remark in a matter-of-fact manner, but Lydia detected underlying amazement. She steadied herself with a deep breath, gripping her letters. The next hours would test every fragment of her reclaimed identity and ability to articulate a life no official record could adequately capture. Colonel Farnsworth received Lydia Haley in a modest but tidy office that smelled faintly of lamp oil and leather. The man himself was nearing 50, his neatly trimmed mustache sprinkled with gray. A seriousness hovered around him that suggested an officer well acquainted with both bureaucratic demands and frontier realities. "You are Lydia Haley," he said, scanning her face with measured curiosity. "Sit, please. I've read reports about the Riverton Creek wagon train tragedy. Many believe no survivors lived to tell that tale." Lydia took the offered chair. She recognized Farnsworth's tone as neither overtly paternalistic nor disbelieving, but somewhere in between, a practiced neutrality that set her slightly at ease. Over the next hour, she recounted the essential facts of her story just as she had planned. She spoke of losing her husband, Alan, burying the dead, wandering the prairie in near delirium, and eventually encountering a Pawnee medicine man who saved her life. She omitted the deeper emotional unraveling, the intangible nightmares, and the profound spiritual shifts. These belonged to her, not to official transcripts. Farnsworth listened attentively, his posture upright. So you've been living among the Pawnee for some months now, he remarked, his pen scratching across a ledger. And you confirmed you remained on your own for years before that, avoiding all contact? She confirmed, yes. I see. Farnsworth paused. And I gather you've come here of your own free will, to re-register, as it were, with the powers that be. She nodded. To clarify my legal status. I also have letters from my family in the East. I intend no trouble. I simply wish to exist without the threat of forced removal or the presumption that I am incompetent. Farnsworth allowed a small, tight smile. Yes, Mr. Garrett Taylor from Indian Affairs was here not long ago urging us to rescue you. He claimed you might be captive or coerced, but I see no sign you're here unwillingly. Lydia almost laughed, recalling how that same paternalistic approach had once shaped her worldview. I was never coerced. Red Hawk offered me shelter and knowledge without demands. She handed over a small packet of documents from her satchel, the letters to her family plus a succinct statement of her identity. Referencing the old records from Riverton Creek. Farnsworth examined them with care, setting them aside with an approving nod. Lieutenant Hayes or one of our clerks can ensure these are dispatched promptly. Do you have proof of your identity beyond memory? The old homestead deeds or personal records? Her breath caught. Proof she had scarcely anything left from her old life except a battered wedding ring in a pouch, plus the partial Bible and a few pages from her teaching notes. Still, she presented the ring, the only tangible link to her prior identity, besides her name scrawled in the front of that scorched Bible. Farnsworth accepted the item, gingerly assessing the inscription that read, "To Lydia, with enduring love, A.H." This matches the details from your old settlement record, Farnsworth confirmed. I think that suffices given the extraordinary circumstances. He rose, stepping toward a cupboard where official seals and forms were kept. We can draft a notarized statement attesting that you've appeared in person, re-established your legal identity, and are not under duress. This will expedite matters, forestalling any overzealous attempts by Indian Affairs to forcibly relocate you. Relief coursed through Lydia. Farnsworth's cooperative stance was more than she had dared hope. He coughed lightly before adding, "Off the record, Mrs. Halley, do you plan to remain in Pawnee territory indefinitely?" She considered the question, choosing her words carefully. I plan to continue learning from them. My past and my future now intersect. I see no need to sever ties with my original culture, but nor do I wish to spurn the welcome that saved me. Farnsworth nodded, his gaze unreadable for a moment. Then a note of genuine respect entered his voice. This territory is full of people who claim to know exactly where boundaries should lie. But the few who find real solutions are those who move between worlds with open eyes. If you can manage that, you might do more good than you realize. When the official forms were finalized, Farnsworth's clerk presented them, each bearing the fort's seal. They confirm your legal reappearance, Farnsworth explained, and declare your autonomy, given there's no evidence of compromised mental capacity. With these documents, you should be free to live as you choose, at least under territorial law. Mind you, not everyone will respect that on site, but it's better than no protection at all. The rest of the day passed in a swirl of minor formalities, signatures, stamps, and the posting of letters. Some of the soldiers looked at Lydia with open curiosity, others with mild suspicion. She walked the fort's corridors, aware that her foreign status here was as palpable as it had been the day she'd first stepped into that earth lodge. Yet she felt no shame, only a calm acceptance that she was bridging two realities. By sunset, she had concluded all the bureaucratic tasks Colonel Farnsworth offered her, the same spare room for another night's rest, but she politely declined. "I'd rather be on my way," she said. "I have a companion waiting." Farnsworth didn't press her, simply gave a polite salute and wished her well. True to her agreement, Lydia left Fort Redwood that early evening, walking briskly past the gatehouse with official papers tucked safely in a small pouch. The sentries gave her a respectful nod, having seen her come and go without incident. She felt the gaze of a few stragglers from the fort yard, but no one stopped her. Soon the timber walls faded into the distance behind her, replaced by open sky and the sprawling palette of the Great Plains at dusk. She followed a meandering trail, the one Red Hawk had indicated would bring her to their rendezvous point. The last rays of sunlight painted the tall grasses in fiery oranges and pinks. In that moment, Lydia experienced a sharp, joyful pang. She was free, not in the trivial sense of being unguarded, but free to define her path. The cavalry had accepted her explanation and recognized her legal personhood. No more rumors of the ghost woman overshadowing her every step. She was no longer bound to a forced re-entry into the settlement's old social structures. that had little room for her new perspective. At twilight's edge, she found Red Hawk waiting beneath a weathered cottonwood precisely where they had parted. He looked up from a small cooking fire as she approached. "They let you walk away," he remarked quietly. His lips curving in what might have been a subtle smile. She nodded, warmth flooding her chest. "I have documents," she explained, tapping her pouch. "Official recognition that I'm alive and not under compulsion. They cannot easily force me anywhere now." Sitting together, they shared a simple meal of smoked meat and leftover bread Lydia had taken from the fort. She recounted the fort's proceedings in measured detail. Colonel Farnsworth's surprisingly cooperative stance, the letter sent east, and her sense that not all soldiers are blind to nuance. Red Hawk listened thoughtfully. "The written words hold power among your people," he acknowledged. "It is good you have them on your side. Your people value spoken word, the power of stories," Lydia reflected. "Perhaps if I can help them interpret these written forms, we can avert misunderstandings." She paused, inhaling the crisp night air. "That's part of what I hope bridging these divides. So tragedies like my wagon train massacre might be less likely." Red Hawk stirred the fire. "Warnings alone do not stop conflicts, but a voice that stands in both worlds sometimes prevents the first arrow or bullet." His manner was calm yet resolute, and as though he too perceived that the real challenge lay not in the fort, but in forging ongoing relationships with the Pawnee band he belonged to. Early the next morning, they broke camp and headed back toward the earthen lodge that had sheltered Lydia's winter recovery. The land between was now in full spring mode, wildflowers peeking up in clusters, birds singing from half-budded trees. Lydia felt an undercurrent of anticipation. Soon enough, Red Hawk's band would arrive, and she would test her capacity to integrate into a culture she knew only from his representations. She recalled the times she'd carefully taught multiplication to a child who initially resisted the concept. One step at a time, leading from simple to complex. So too would she approach, meeting the Pawnee elders, offering small acts of respect, before expecting deeper acceptance. At midday, they paused to rest near a shallow stream, letting the horses acquired by Red Hawk from some distant trading contact graze on fresh grass. Lydia found herself reflecting on how much she had regained, speech reason and a measure of emotional resilience. Yet the ghost of the massacre still lurked at the edges of her consciousness, surfacing as nightmares or sudden flashes of memory. She wondered if complete absolution from that haunting would ever exist, or if some measure of sorrow was the necessary residue of having survived. Red Hawk caught her pensive look. "Healing is not forgetting," he said gently. "It is carrying the memory differently with less pain and more purpose." Lydia smiled, appreciative that she no longer had to force a brave face around him. "I used to think knowledge was about controlling what we don't understand. Now I see it might be about harmonizing with truths beyond our immediate grasp." She marveled at how her own words echoed the teacherly phrases she once used, yet her meaning now was deeper, an admission that knowledge served not as a fortress, but a connecting thread among varied experiences. When they finally saw the silhouette of the earthen lodge on the distant slope, Lydia's steps quickened. Strange how a structure built by a culture once deemed alien could now evoke a sense of homecoming. Inside, the air was stale from disuse, so they opened the flap to let the breeze swirl out the winter's final gloom. Red Hawk began reorganizing the space with swift efficiency, anticipating the arrival of warmer days. Lydia assisted, noticing a certain inevitability in their joint actions. Neither needed to state that they intended to remain together for this next phase. That shared understanding wove itself seamlessly into their tasks. Settling on a mat by the fire pit, Lydia carefully withdrew the sealed letters from her pack, each addressed to family members or old acquaintances. She would find a way to confirm they'd be posted regularly, perhaps via the fort's supply runs. Let them see her words. Let them read of her decision to dwell among a people she once might have taught about in abstract terms. She realized it would be a jarring revelation for them, just as the attacks had been a jarring revelation for her. But honesty had become her anchor, no more half-truths or ghostly avoidance. She was Lydia Halley, alive by her own volition, forging a path at the intersection of two worlds. Over the following weeks, spring bloomed in earnest, carpeting the prairie with wildflowers and drawing migratory birds to endless skies. In that time, Lydia and Red Hawk prepared for the arrival of the Pawnee band. He explained that these people were extended family, spiritual kin, and community members who wintered south following buffalo herds and carrying out essential ceremonies. They would cross through a valley not far from the lodge, where they traditionally paused to set up seasonal camps. Lydia recalled how Red Hawk had mentioned that Pawnee society encompassed far more than the scattered images she had gleaned from white textbooks or frontier gossip. There were clans each with distinct responsibilities in a council that oversaw decisions for the band. Some members might be open-minded about a white woman in their midst. Others would be wary or outright hostile. Lydia found herself oscillating between excitement and apprehension. She remembered her days of teaching back when bridging differences meant coaxing an unruly farm child to hold a pencil correctly. Now she faced bridging an entire cultural chasm. The magnitude of the task occasionally set her heart pounding, especially when she imagined potential accusations. Was she claiming Pawnee identity? Was she contaminating their traditions with foreign ideas? Or was she truly forging something cooperative, something that might have the power to prevent tragedies like the one that had shattered her old life? In quieter moments, she wrote in her notebook, setting down how the fort's formalities had unexpectedly paved her path forward. Colonel Farnsworth's rational acceptance of her statement highlighted the potential for official neutrality, if not full endorsement. She recognized that a single misstep, perhaps an overzealous Indian Affairs official, could still unravel everything. But for now, a delicate window of possibility remained open, one that Red Hawk also seemed determined to preserve. They continued to refine practical strategies. Red Hawk suggested that Lydia gather items that demonstrated her willingness to contribute, such as a set of small teaching aids she had fashioned from carved wood. Show them your skill as an educator, not as an imposed voice from outside, he advised. Many will weigh the sincerity of your actions more than any words. In turn, Lydia asked him for deeper knowledge of ritual etiquette, how to greet elders, the significance of gifts, the times one should remain silent. She discovered a close parallel to her old classroom ethic, where a teacher must read each child's temperament, adjusting method and tone to match. The day arrived when a distant column of dust signaled the approach of the Pawnee band. Lydia stood at the top of a small bluff, heart thumping. Through the heat shimmer, she saw riders leading families in wagons or on foot. Children whooped running ahead to greet the new location, while older individuals moved at a measured pace. Red Hawk joined her on the bluff, a staff in hand, whose carvings denoted his status. We meet them at the edge, he explained, voice calm but carrying an undertone of solemn pride. Her first encounter with the band's elders held a formality, reminiscent of certain frontier gatherings, except the language and gestures were Pawnee, and the environment was a wide-open plain. Red Hawk performed an introduction in Pawnee referencing Lydia's survival ordeal and her desire to learn their ways. She listened attentively, not understanding every phrase but discerning the respectful tone. Some elders scrutinized her with wariness. Others eyed her with curiosity. 2 or 3 younger adults looked ready to challenge her presence outright, but withheld open hostility in deference to Red Hawk. At length, an older woman in richly quilled buckskin stepped forward. Red Hawk identified her as Walking Star, a respected midwife and wisdom keeper. She asked Lydia questions in halting English about what she hoped to accomplish. Lydia responded carefully, explaining that she came not to replace Pawnee teachings, but to share certain reading and writing skills, perhaps mathematics, which might help in negotiations with forts and settlers. She had no illusions that these clarifications would instantly dispel skepticism, but she stood firmly, refusing to hide the tremor in her voice. That night, the band set up a provisional camp near the same valley Red Hawk had described. Lydia and Red Hawk returned to the earthen lodge with an unspoken consensus that from this point forward, Lydia's presence among them was trial by action. If she contributed meaningfully, they would evaluate her with open minds. The next morning, she gathered a small group of children around a tree stump near the Pawnee tents, showing them how English letters form phonetic building blocks. She also had them trace shapes in the soil, explaining how each shape connected to quantities or ideas. The children giggled occasionally, repeating the letters or shapes with wide-eyed fascination. Some adults observed from a distance, arms folded, evaluating. Lydia felt a mixture of vulnerability and determination. She had once taught in a formal schoolhouse with desks and a chalkboard. Now she taught in the open air, using a stick as her pointer and the ground as her slate. Yet the joy of teaching felt the same, the spark of comprehension in a child's gaze. As exciting as ever, Red Hawk stood beside her, offering translations or additional cultural references to help the children connect new symbols to their existing knowledge. The synergy electrified Lydia. This was no forced assimilation. It felt more like a genuine exchange, even if some older Pawnee watchers remained skeptical. Days passed in this manner, Lydia conducting informal lessons, the band's daily life unfolding around her. She learned about traditional gatherings, the significance of the upcoming summer hunts, and the rituals that called upon protective spirits. In turn, she introduced basic arithmetic, telling them how traders at the fort might cheat them if they couldn't interpret certain numerals. Some men tested her assertions by bringing mock trade scenarios, and she gave examples of how unscrupulous merchants altered prices. Not every person was swayed, but enough curiosity and positive feedback accumulated that Lydia sensed a cautious acceptance. She comprehended this was just a beginning. Real trust would take months or years. But each day she rested her head in the earthen lodge, hearing the soft hum of Pawnee singing. Drifting from the encampment, she felt a sense of belonging that was neither forced nor merely tolerated. A new identity was forming, neither ghost woman nor purely settler teacher, but a boundary crosser. Someone forging fresh ties that might with patience yield deeper harmony. Weeks later, as spring gave way to the earliest signs of summer on the open plains, Lydia stood at the edge of a communal gathering in the Pawnee camp. The council circle was larger now, with additional families joining from more distant winter sites. Drums sounded a steady rhythm. Children darted around chasing each other in game, and an air of anticipation surrounded the pending buffalo hunts. Red Hawk introduced her more formally to certain council members as Lydia Halley, a teacher who once walked a path of sorrow, but now stands ready to share knowledge for the good of all. The phrase carried spiritual weight in Pawnee tradition, emphasizing transformation, walking from sorrow into contribution. Some elders nodded in silent respect, while others offered a handshake in the manner they had learned from occasional dealings with settlers. Lydia bowed her head politely, feeling a fragile sense of gratitude. She had always believed education could be a tool for liberation. Now she was applying that creed in ways that merged Pawnee customs with the frontier's demands for literacy and negotiation. She had no illusions that the larger historical forces at work, federal policies on tribal lands, the constant push of new settlers, the unscrupulous aspects of trade would vanish. But in this small sphere, one teacher and one medicine man had managed to carve out an unconventional alliance, her norm. Nights in the earthen lodge remained punctuated by dreams of the massacre, but the nightmares no longer ruled her waking hours. Instead, she recognized them as the mind's attempt to process an irreparable trauma. Occasionally, she journaled about them, describing how Red Hawk's presence and the acceptance, tentative though it was, of the Pawnee families provided a salve for those invisible wounds. She would reread her own words from months prior, seeing how each sentence had gradually shifted from despair to cautious hope and now to purposeful action. Once Colonel Farnsworth from Fort Redwood sent a messenger with an update, Lydia's letters had reached her eastern family, who responded in shock, relief, and confusion. They pled with her to return east for proper recovery. She penned a reply carefully acknowledging their concerns, but explaining that her continued growth depended on this chosen path, bridging the frontiers. She recognized heartbreak in reading their longing, but also realized she had come too far to revert to the woman they expected. She promised one day to visit on her own terms, when she could do so without forfeiting her new identity or deserting her responsibilities here. On a warm evening colored by a sublime sunset that layered pink, orange, and lavender across the sky, Lydia walked along the river's edge with Red Hawk. Crickets chirped in the grass, and the distant Pawnee drums sounded faintly from behind the low hills. They spoke of little things, how the day's lesson with half a dozen Pawnee children had introduced them to shapes beyond simple circles, how Red Hawk planned to address certain spiritual ceremonies in the coming week, how the band might soon move again to follow the buffalo's shifting patterns. They paused at a small rise, the sky's last glow illuminating her hair in silhouette. She gazed outward, remembering her initial arrival in this territory as a hopeful bride, then her slow descent into near-animal survival, and finally her improbable rescue and reemergence as something new. She took a breath, the mild spring air filling her lungs without the tightness of fear. "I never imagined," she murmured, "that the land could both break and heal a person in such extremes." Red Hawk nodded, his gaze reflecting the same horizon. "The land invites us to adapt or succumb. You chose to adapt even when your spirit was shattered. That is a form of courage no training can instill." Silence enveloped them for a few heartbeats, a silence charged with affirmation rather than emptiness. The rhythmic hum of night insects and distant water merged with her own steady heartbeat. Lydia closed her eyes, allowing the sense of dual belonging, her bridging role, to wash over her. She envisioned writing the next pages in her journal, capturing how the Pawnee elders received her lessons, how children's laughter seemed to mend the echo of wagon screams in her memory. When she opened her eyes, Red Hawk offered a small but warm smile. He gestured toward the camp. "We should return. The moon is bright, but the elders might wonder if we lost track of time." She chuckled softly. "I suppose that's a better worry than losing track of my entire self." Together, they retraced their steps toward the blend of flickering campfires and earthen lodges. The path was neither lonely wilderness nor rigid fort structure, but a shared middle ground suffused with hopeful possibility. Every stride felt like an affirmation of the life she had reclaimed and continued to shape a life that would not yield to the singular definitions of any one culture. She had chosen a path that honored the memory of all she lost, the knowledge she once cherished, and the new wisdom gleaned from a medicine man's teachings. In the glimmer of that spring night, Lydia Halley recognized a truth she had once glimpsed fleetingly in a lesson plan. Growth arises at boundaries, in those precarious edges where seeming opposites meet. She was that boundary now, a woman who walked from east to west, from devastation to renewal, from isolation to communion. The nightmares would remain, but so would the strength to greet them, and for the first time in a long while, the horizon held more promise than fear. If you found resonance in her journey, consider how your own story may straddle boundaries and create fresh understanding. Out here on the ever-shifting frontier, geographical or metaphorical, healing comes not from erasing wounds, but from weaving them into new, bolder patterns of living. In the end, Lydia Halley's decision to reintroduce herself to the world did more than grant her official recognition. It affirmed her right to define her own life after unimaginable loss. Guided by Red Hawk's compassionate teachings, she learned that true healing integrates both sorrow and strength, bridging cultures without discarding either. While some in the fort believed her compromised, Lydia calmly presented her evidence of survival and intentions for the future. Securing the papers that affirmed her legal identity, she returned to Red Hawk with renewed purpose. From that day onward, Lydia's life no longer straddled a chasm of fear and isolation. Instead, she embraced a nuanced role shaping understanding between Pawnee families and frontier settlers, reminding each side that learning flows both ways. Her story stands as a testament that trauma need not end in perpetual wandering. It can, with courage, blossom into empathy, purpose, and fresh beginnings. Let us know your thoughts below, comment, and share your impressions. And as always, subscribe to support more inspiring stories just like this.